Hello, YouTube friends. Welcome, everyone. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Chapter 1. The Child of the Bridge. The first time Julia heard about Clinton Road was on a rainy early morning during a meeting with her co-workers. They were in the break room of the local radio station, sharing stories to kill the tedium. That's when old Gus, the sound technician, spoke in a muffled voice, almost as if he feared something was listening. "Have you heard about the boy on the bridge?" he asked, and the room fell silent. Clinton Road, he explained, was a 10-mile stretch of cracked asphalt and sharp curves, flanked by thick woods where sunlight barely touched the ground. They said things happened there that no one could explain. Sightings of shadowy figures, lights with no visible source, satanic rites, and above all, the ghost of a boy who inhabited an old bridge near Dead Man's Curve Lake. "If you throw a coin into the creek from that bridge," said Gus, "the boy throws it back. It's not a story. I lived it." Julia laughed nervously, not because she didn't believe in the supernatural, but because she was afraid to believe too much. Ever since she was a child, she had felt a special sensitivity to the invisible. Vivid dreams, unexplainable shivers, the certainty of not being alone when she was in her room. So that night, Gus's story kept her awake. The idea to visit Clinton Road started as a joke between her and her friend Caleb, a paranormal buff who had a YouTube channel about haunted locations. Caleb was thrilled with the idea. He planned the excursion for a Saturday just after midnight. Darkness, he insisted, was essential, and they would record everything. The drive from Newark was quiet. As they drove, the forest closed in around them like a theater curtain. The GPS blinked and then died, as if the road had absorbed even the satellite signal. Julia felt a knot in her stomach. When they finally reached the bridge, the full moon was reflected in the murky water of the stream. The bridge was old, made of stone and decayed wood. Caleb set up a camera with night vision while Julia looked around, feeling watched. The silence was so thick that even the rustle of a branch in the distance sounded like a gunshot. "Here it is," said Caleb, with a smile. He pulled out a penny and held it over the edge of the bridge. "Let's see if the kid will play with us tonight." The coin fell with a small splash. Julia held her breath. Nothing. The silence persisted, unperturbed. "Maybe it's not today," Caleb muttered, disappointed. But just as they were about to return to the car, they heard a soft sound, like the scraping of something metallic rolling on wood. Julia turned around, and her eyes grew large. A coin was in the center of the bridge, a coin identical to the one Caleb had flipped. "It can't be," he whispered, approaching slowly. The coin vibrated, then it stopped. Julia took a step back, frozen. A small figure, barely visible in the lunar glow, stood on the other side of the bridge. It was the silhouette of a child. His eyes were two dark wells. Caleb raised the camera. The child did not move. "Are you the one who returns the coins?" he asked aloud, with a mixture of mockery and fear. The boy raised an arm. He pointed to it. Julia screamed. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the arm was bent, unnatural, or the total absence of expression on that blurry face. She turned to Caleb, but he wasn't recording. His gaze was fixed, completely transfixed. Then the figure disappeared. Julia grabbed Caleb by the arm and they ran to the car. The doors slammed shut, but the engine wouldn't start. They tried several times, sweating, panting, as the silence of the forest turned to muted laughter. Finally, the car started, and they shot out of there. That night, Julia did not sleep, and it wasn't because of the child. It was because of what he found the next day. When they reviewed the recording, they discovered that the video stopped right after the coin toss. Then there was only static. However, in the last few seconds, an image appeared. Julia, standing alone on the bridge, and next to her, a tall, thin, hooded figure they had not seen there. "What's that?" Caleb muttered, pale. "That is not the child," Julia answered, feeling a shiver on the back of her neck. From that day on, strange things began to happen to him. Objects changed places in his house. He heard footsteps in the night. Shadows crossed out of the corner of his eye. Once he found an identical coin on his pillow. And then one morning, upon waking up, she noticed that something had been written on her bathroom mirror with wet fingers. Chapter 2. The Midnight Ranger. Since that night on the bridge, Julia's life became a parade of shadows, whispers, and veiled warnings. The nights were the worst. She slept with the lights on, but the darkness seemed to creep in just the same, as if the electricity couldn't scare away what it had brought with it from Clinton Road. Caleb, for his part, became obsessed. He spent hours reviewing the video over and over again, looking for patterns in the static, analyzing frames, even hiring a technician to try to recover lost footage. But no matter how much effort he put in, the tall figure next to Julia remained barely a distorted silhouette, as if the archive itself was reluctant to reveal its truth. "Julia," he told her one night on the phone, "I've been doing some research. There's more than the boy in the bridge. A lot more. Have you heard about the ranger?" She felt a shiver. "What ranger?" "They say there's a spirit that patrols that road at night. A guy in an old uniform, like from the 50s. Some people have seen him walking through the woods. Others say he appears if you try to stray from the road. But they all agree on one thing. If you see him, he follows you." Julia swallowed. "What are you saying?" "That there is something beyond the bridge. Something we didn't see." Despite the fear, something in Julia needed answers. She couldn't live with the constant suspicion that something was stalking her. So a week later, she returned with Caleb to Clinton Road. This time, they decided to go further out beyond the bridge, into a deeper, more isolated stretch, where rumor had it that there were remnants of ancient encampments and ritual areas. They entered through an access hidden in the undergrowth, using flashlights and a drone equipped with a thermal camera. It wasn't long before the atmosphere became oppressive. The air was thicker. The sounds of the forest seemed farther away, as if they had been submerged underwater. Halfway there, they found what appeared to be an old, half-ruined cabin. It was small, rotten wood, with a collapsed chimney and what was left of a porch covered with dry leaves. Caleb was excited. He pulled out his camera while Julia stood near the door, feeling that every step was being watched by unseen eyes. Inside the cabin, they discovered a dusty book wrapped in a damp tarp. The pages were filled with notations in black ink. Names, dates, coordinates. Some names were crossed out. Others appeared several times, followed by Latin words. "It looks like a record," Caleb muttered. "A record of what?" Before he could respond, they were both paralyzed by a noise outside the hut. It was not an animal. It was the slow, heavy crunch of boots on leaf litter. A steady rhythm, almost military. Caleb turned off the flashlight. Julia gasped. The sound stopped right in front of the door. Seconds, or maybe minutes, passed. None of them dared to move. Then very slowly, the rusty doorknob turned sideways. A creaking sound announced it. But the door did not open. Only a deep, harsh voice was heard, which seemed to emanate from the forest itself. "You should not be here." The door banged loudly, as if something had disappeared on the other side. They ran out the back of the hut, into the woods aimlessly, until they came to an old dirt road. The drone, when it was still operational, began to emit a warning signal. Caleb looked at it with wide eyes. "Julia, there is something following us." "What?" He showed her the screen. A humanoid figure was walking among the trees, with an even pace, always at the same distance. It was not running. It was just walking. But it never stopped. He did not speak again. They on back to the car. When they reached it, panting and covered in scratches, the wheels were covered in mud, and there were boot prints all around. They started as best they could, and did not stop until they reached the city. That night, Julia received a call on her cell phone from an unknown number. She answered with a trembling voice. "Hello?" On the other side, only silence. Then a faint murmur. "You know where I live." He hung up suddenly. She tried to call Caleb, but he didn't answer. She went to his apartment the next morning and found it in disarray, as if someone had packed in a hurry. On his desk was a note. "Don't record it. Don't look at it. Don't name it." He never heard from Caleb again. The next few days were worse. Julia began to see the ranger in places he shouldn't be, reflected in windows standing across the street. Sometimes, as she closed her eyes, she could hear his footsteps approaching. The worst was the night she dreamed she was walking alone down Clinton Road, with the moon shining over her head. In the dream, she came to an old cabin. Inside, there was a tall figure in an old uniform, his back turned, writing in a book. As he approached, the figure turned. It was Caleb. His eyes were completely white. "Now I patrol this forest," he said, without moving his lips. "They chose me." Julia woke up screaming, holding a coin in her hand. It was the same one Caleb had tossed on the bridge the first time. Engraved on the edge was a word. Stay. Chapter 3. The Guardian of the Way. Julia no longer knew what was real and what was not. It had been weeks since she had last seen Caleb. Since that night when the ranger appeared to her, the events in her life had become increasingly puzzling. The objects in her apartment kept moving on their own. Her reflection in the mirrors sometimes didn't match her movements. And the dreams. The dreams took her farther and farther away, to that same place she could no longer forget. Clinton Road. Every night he sat on the edge of his bed, watching the full moon through the window, waiting for the memories of the cabin, the tall figure, and the boot prints to disappear. But they didn't. Every night, the presence of the ranger, Caleb turned wraith, stalked her closer. It was then that he decided he had to go back. At first, she thought it might be a way to bring closure, to put an end to everything that had happened. Maybe if she went back into Clinton Road, she could find a way to free Caleb, or at least understand what had tied her to that place. The morning she made her decision, Julia plucked up her courage. She loaded a flashlight, water, and the old book she had found in the cabin into her backpack. She knew she shouldn't do it, but something inside her was pushing her to go. As if a voice whispered to her that the only way to get rid of the nightmare was to confront it face to face. The drive to Clinton Road was slow. the road empty and the lights of the city already fading into the horizon. By the time he arrived, a thick fog had descended on the road, enveloping the trees in a ghostly blanket. The air was heavy and cold. Julia turned off the car's engine and for a moment stared into the forest, the darkness impenetrable before her. He knew he had to go to the bridge, the place where it all began, but he couldn't help diverting his gaze to the forest, where the path to the old cabin was almost invisible, as if the road had been erased by time and undergrowth. The sound of a cracking branch brought her out of her thoughts. In the distance, he saw a figure. At first, he thought it was an illusion, a trick of his fatigued mind, but it was not. It was a man standing at the edge of the road, just outside the area where the fog thickened. A tall man wearing a gray uniform and a wide-brimmed hat that partially covered his face. He was not far away, but the figure's face was hard to make out. I could only see the eyes, opaque, empty. The flashlight in his hands trembled, but he forced himself to take a step forward. The figure did not move. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice firmer than he felt. The figure raised his hand, pointing into the forest, without saying a word. A cold sweat broke out on Julia's back. She knew what that meant. She had to keep going, or this whole thing would never end. Taking one step after another, she began to walk in the direction the ranger had pointed, into the fog, toward the thick forest that loomed in front of her. As he walked, he began to notice the footprints. At first, there were just a few marks in the mud, but as he went on, the trail became clearer. Heavy, deep boots, as if something very large had passed that way recently. The tracks were heading straight for the cabin. Julia was no longer afraid. She had come too far, and she could not stop now. When she finally reached the cabin, the door was ajar. The figure of the ranger was not visible, but a sense of pressure enveloped her. Inside, the cabin was more dilapidated than last time. The wood creaked under her feet, and the air was permeated with a musty odor. The light from her flashlight illuminated the dark corners, revealing what had once been a cozy refuge, now transformed into a mausoleum of forgotten memories. On the table, there was still the book Caleb had found. Julia approached it slowly, taking it in trembling hands. The pages were still covered with notes, but there was something different this time. On the last page, written in red ink, was a message. "The road has no end. The Guardian does not stop. Only you can close the gate." Before she could process the meaning of those words, she heard a rustling sound behind her. She turned quickly, but saw nothing. However, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The cabin door slammed shut. Julia ... The voice was weak at first, like a whisper, but then it became clearer. "Julia." It was Caleb's voice. It could not be. She turned to look for him, but all she saw was the shadow of a tall figure moving slowly toward her. His face was covered by a hood, but his eyes glowed with an unnatural radiance. "No ... Julia whispered, backing away. She couldn't let this happen again. She couldn't be another victim of the ranger. The man raised his hand, and suddenly a gust of wind pushed her back, forcing her to the ground. Leaves rose around her like curtains of shadows, but the worst thing was not the wind. The worst thing was what she saw on the ground. The footprints. They were back, all around her, marking the way back. But there was something else, a few words, as if etched into the earth. "Chosen." At that moment, he understood. The ranger didn't just patrol the road. He protected it, kept the lost in their place, looking for those like Julia to follow in his footsteps into eternity. She had been chosen, not because of her bravery or her desire to understand, but because Clinton Road had decided she was next. The shadows surrounded her, slowly closing in. Through the fog, she saw the figure of the ranger, striding steadily toward her. She no longer had a choice. The door closed behind her, for good. Police found Julia's car the next morning, parked on the edge of Clinton Road. Inside, the phone was on the passenger's seat, with a recording that was never heard. Clinton Road was never heard from again. Chapter 1. The Night Journey. The night on Clinton Road hung over the trees like an impenetrable black blanket. The road, long and winding, crossed a desolate landscape where only the murmur of the wind interrupted the absolute silence. No one in their right mind would dare to take it after dark. But on that summer night, 3 young people decided to defy the legend. Jacob, Sarah, and Michael had heard about Clinton Road on several occasions. The road had a reputation for being cursed, filled with stories of unexplained disappearances, strange lights on the horizon, and vehicles that seemed to move on their own. The stories that swirled around this place, told amidst nervous laughter at gatherings with friends, failed to keep them awake at night. In fact, they were curious. It was the kind of adventure everyone embarks on in youth, to brave the unknown, to see if there is any truth to the stories. Aboard an old sedan, they headed toward the Clinton Road entry point, not knowing that that night would not be like all the others. The starry sky offered an eerie beauty as they advanced along the deserted road. The moonlight faintly illuminated the cracked pavement and the shadows of the trees, whose contours seemed to move and lengthen in the distance. The atmosphere was charged, as if the earth itself breathed with a life of its own. Suddenly, the car began to emit a strange sound, as if something was hitting the underside. Jacob, who was at the wheel, frowned and accelerated a little, but the noise persisted. "Did you hear that?" asked Michael, looking out the windows, searching for an answer in the darkness. Sarah nodded, but tried to play it down. "It's probably just a rock or something in the road," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. But something was not right. There was a presence in the air, something palpable, that seemed to oppress their chests. Although the road was completely empty, the trees on either side of the road leaned strangely toward them, as if they were watching. As they moved forward, a pair of lights began to glow in the distance, hovering just above the road. They were not typical car lights, or even lights from some distant headlight. They were diffuse, blue-colored lights, moving erratically from side to side. Michael, with his camera in hand, tried to record what he saw, but the lights disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. "Did you see it?" Michael said nervously. "That wasn't normal." Jacob pressed the accelerator, determined to continue on his way. He knew that if they stopped in the middle of Clinton Road, something else might happen. The sun had already gone down completely, and the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as if darkness itself was lurking. At the sharpest bend in the road, a large rusty sign suddenly appeared before them. The letters, though partially faded by the passage of time and the weather, were still legible. "Beware of dogs." Jacob didn't know what to think. Loose dogs? A warning message from some madman? He thought it best not to stop. As they continued, the car began to lose power. A strange humming sound emerged from the engine, and the headlights flickered several times before shutting off completely. A shiver ran down Sarah's back. "What's going on?" he asked in a trembling voice. Jacob tried to start the car again, but the battery was completely dead. The air was getting thicker, and suddenly, a distant scream echoed in the darkness. The sound was like a mixture between a wail and a roar, something inhuman. Everyone in the car fell silent, hearts pounding, as a sense of dread enveloped them. "That can't be human," Michael whispered, looking nervously out the windows. Jacob, trembling with fear, tried to open the car door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed. The scream was repeated, this time much closer. The sound seemed to be surrounding them. Sarah, with her eyes fixed on the window, saw something that made her scream. In the deepest shadows of the forest, something was moving. At first it was just a blurry figure, but then it became more clearly delineated. A man, or what looked like a man, but with a strange, crouched posture, almost as if he were crawling toward them. Fear gripped them. Jacob tried to start the car once more, but the lights would not come back on. The man, or whatever he was, began to move quickly toward the vehicle. It was then that a howl of dogs broke the air. Not normal dogs, but creatures from another world, whose howls seemed to pierce the skin and reach deep inside. The three looked at each other, terrified, not knowing what to do. Suddenly the car jerked, as if something was hitting it. The windows began to vibrate, and, in the distance, the sound of footsteps, shuffling in the darkness, came closer and closer. And then, with a last glimmer of light, the car went out completely. Everything was silent, a deep and absolute silence. Chapter 2. The Spectre of Clinton Road. The silence that followed the blackout of the car was so thick it was almost touchable. The three friends looked at each other, paralyzed with fear. The engine no longer made any noise, and the lights, though they tried to flicker again, remained off. The atmosphere in the air was heavy, charged with a tension that could be felt in the bones. Every breath seemed amplified, as if the air itself was waiting for something. "What's going on?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling, her face pale, and her eyes full of terror. Jacob did not respond. Instead, he just stared out at the forest that stretched beyond the car windows. Something was there, something that didn't belong to this world. He could feel it. It was a palpable presence, as if it were watching them from the shadows. A distant rustling sound, as if someone stepped on a broken branch, echoed in the air, and the three turned in unison toward the sound. A pair of lights, now dim, began to glow in the distance, moving erratically, as if floating in the air. But this time, they were not just lights. They were figures, shadows gliding through the trees, slowly approaching the vehicle. That's not normal," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking aloud might attract something even more horrible. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind hit the car windows, and a deep, almost guttural sound echoed through the darkness. The human figure Sarah had seen earlier was much closer, only a few feet from the car, with an even stranger and more disturbing posture. He was hunched over, walking in circles around the vehicle, as if inspecting it, as if he had all the time in the world. The figure was no ordinary human being. Its face was dark, barely visible in the gloom, but the eyes glowed with an unhealthy red light, as if possessed by something beyond human comprehension. The body seemed to writhe in an unnatural way, as if its bones were breaking and reassembling with every movement. "Don't look into her eyes," Jacob suddenly shouted, his voice choked with fear. The three turned quickly to the car windows, and as they did so, they heard a frightening sound. A whisper, so low it seemed to come from the earth itself, ran through the interior of the vehicle. "Come back before it's too late." The warning came like a cold sigh, and fear swept over them completely. However, the terror was even deeper when the sound of shuffling footsteps suddenly stopped. The figure, now closer than ever, leaned toward the car. The lights flickered once more, and the figure stopped in front of Jacob's window. Suddenly, a deafening bang echoed off the glass, causing everyone in the car to startle. The figure, with a crooked smile that seemed to defy any human logic, struck once more, this time with inhuman force. The glass of the car began to shake, and a metallic sound rent the air, as if something was trying to break through the car door. "Get it started, quickly!" Michael shouted, panic evident in his voice. Jacob, in desperation, tried again to start the engine, but the car did not respond. The terror increased as the figure came closer and closer. They could hear his raspy breathing, his breath warm and heavy on the glass. "They're trapped," whispered the voice again, this time louder, as if coming from inside the car. Then, with one last effort, Jacob turned the key once more, and the engine roared. The lights flashed briefly before going out again, but this time the car began to move slowly, even though the engine seemed to be misfiring. The car moved forward, clumsily, as if something was pushing it. The figure disappeared into the shadows, as if vanishing into the trees. But the fear did not vanish. The three looked around, searching for some sign of what had happened, but everything was still the same. The road was still deserted. Darkness enveloped every corner. Suddenly a roar echoed in the distance. It was the sound of something big, something racing toward them. Jacob pushed the gas pedal to the metal, but the car was not responding. It was failing again. The roar was rapidly approaching. "Let's go," Sarah shouted, looking in the rearview mirror, and then, as if by an unbreakable curse, the car came to a complete stop. Chapter 3. The Last Warning. The road was as dark as an abyss. Neither the edge of the trees nor the line of the road could be seen. All that existed at that moment was the presence of something supernatural, something that had been waiting in the shadows for generations. And now, the three friends were trapped in the center of that darkness. The car's engine stopped running completely, and Jacob tried to start it again and again, but the battery was already dead. The car, once their refuge, became a trap. The three looked at each other, fear reflected in their eyes. Suddenly a shadow moved close to them, so fast that they barely had time to react. A tall, slender figure appeared in front of them, emerging from the shadows of the forest. He was not human, not by any means. His skin was covered in a layer of darkness, and his face seemed to decay with every step he took. Michael tried to open the door to escape, but the handle broke off in his hands. He could not escape. They could not escape. The figure came closer and closer, and with each step the air grew thicker, as if it were impossible to breathe. A low cry emerged from the figure, like a deep, resonant whisper. "Come back before it's too late," repeated the voice echoing inside their minds. "Darkness never forgives." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, closed her eyes tightly. wishing it was all a bad dream. But when she opened them again, the figure was right in front of her, extending a bony hand toward the glass. An icy breath seeped through the air, and the figure stared at her, its eyes empty of humanity. Fear paralyzed the three of them. Jacob, Michael, and Sarah knew there was no time left. But then, as if by magic, the car jerked violently and with a deafening roar began to move forward, crawling slowly. The scenery began to fade as the car moved down the deserted road, away from the evil. But all three knew one thing. They were not out of danger. Something had marked them that night. Something about Clinton Road wouldn't let them go so easily. Chapter 1. The Shadow of the Forest. Clinton Road was not just a road, but a living history. The dark strip that crisscrossed northern New Jersey seemed to have a life of its own, pulling travelers into its ominous embrace. It was known to locals as a cursed place, full of accidents, disappearances, and unexplained phenomena. No one who had lived near that area could deny the aura of unease that always surrounded that strip of asphalt. One cold October night, three friends decided to defy the rumors. Jeff, Laura, and Mark, daring young thrill-seekers, hopped in a car and took to the road, armed only with their flashlights and the bravery of youth. They had heard the stories of the road, from ghostly figures to the rumor of the boy from the lake, and wanted to see for themselves if it was all true, or just superstition. At first, the road seemed harmless, a straight stretch surrounded by trees that swayed gently to the rhythm of the wind. The full moon faintly illuminated the road, but as they advanced, something began to change. The atmosphere felt thick, as if the air was charged with static electricity. Jeff, who was driving, frowned and looked at his friends. "Does anyone else feel this?" he asked, his voice somewhat strained. Laura and Mark looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" asked Mark, looking out the window. "It's like the air is heavier, like someone is watching us," Jeff replied. They sped up a bit, trying to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling. But that's when something strange happened. In the blink of an eye, the car's lights flickered and then went out. The engine went out as well. The car stopped in the middle of the road, completely silent. "What the hell?" muttered Laura, staring into the darkness around them. At that moment, a noise, low and shuffling, began to be heard from the woods to the left. The sound of breaking branches, as if something or someone was moving quickly through the woods. Mark rolled down the window but saw nothing beyond the pitch blackness. "Maybe we should get out," Laura suggested, her voice a little shaky. Jeff nodded, trying to start the engine again, but to no avail. Suddenly, the sound of something heavy and large crossing the woods grew louder, approaching rapidly. The Shadow of the Forest. "I don't like this," exclaimed Mark, now frantically looking out the windows. Out of nowhere, a glow appeared in the distance among the trees. First, it was a bright spot, like a light. Then it grew closer, but what the three saw was even more terrifying. The light seemed to move, but not like a flashlight or a lamp. It was more like a luminous floating figure, gliding through the trees without making a sound. Terrified, the three stared. The glow enveloped them, making them feel as if they were being watched by something beyond human. And when the figure finally disappeared into the trees, the silence was even heavier. That's when the engine started on its own. Jeff couldn't believe it, but the car came to life. The three of them looked at each other, not daring to say a word as the vehicle sped down the road, driving away from the scene as fast as possible. Chapter 2. The Lake of Shadows. Despite what they had experienced, the three friends decided to return to Clinton Road. The sense of mystery had drawn them once again, although now fear was a constant companion. That night, however, they would get closer to the legend of the boy from the lake. There were rumors among the locals about a boy who drowned in a small lake near the road. The boy's spirit, it was said, haunted the area, waiting for those who dared to approach his eternal resting place. Some claimed to have seen a ghostly figure of a child. Others heard distant laughter in the stillness of the night. Determined to confront the myth, Jeff, Laura, and Mark parked their car near the lake at midnight. The atmosphere was even heavier than the previous time. The lake water was dark, almost black, and the moon reflected faintly on its surface, creating an air of indescribable heaviness. "Hear that?" whispered Laura, her eyes fixed on the water. A child's laughter, soft but unmistakable, reached her ears. It was a child's laughter, but it was distorted, as if coming from an unreachable depth. Mark, visibly disturbed, pointed toward the shore. "There, don't you see that?" A shadow moved among the trees near the water. It was a small figure, barely visible in the darkness. The three stood transfixed, watching in silence as the figure slowly approached. And then the boy appeared, a ghostly figure, shrouded in a thick fog, with a pale face and empty eyes. The air became icy. The boy looked at them without a word, but his presence was unsettling. With a fluid motion, he began to walk toward the water, shuffling his feet as if he were floating rather than walking. Laura, terrified, tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The boy disappeared into the dark waters of the lake, and instantly the sound of laughter faded into nothingness. The three friends, without a word, ran back to their car. But when they got into the car and looked back, the boy was there, standing on the shore, watching them with those empty eyes. And before they could react, a wave of terror hit them like an invisible wall. The car sped off, but the memories of that night would haunt them forever. Chapter 3. The Road to the End. Jeff, Laura, and Mark's experiences at Clinton Road left them with a sense of paranoia that would not go away. Every night, the face of the boy from the lake would appear in their dreams, and laughter could be heard in the darkest corners of their minds. No one could forget, but something else awaited them. Months later, they decided to return once again, this time with the intention of solving once and for all the secrets surrounding Clinton Road. There were rumors that the road was an ancient place of sacrifice, a path used by dark cults centuries ago. They decided to investigate thoroughly, not knowing that this time the horror would not be something they could escape. When they arrived, the road was even more deserted than before. A few misshapen trees stood like specters, their branches stretching like claws to the sky. As they advanced, a thick fog began to surround them, making everything blurry and distorted. Suddenly the car began to brake for no reason. The lights flickered and then went out. In the darkness, the sound of footsteps nearby reached their ears. At first they thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too human. A figure appeared in front of the car. It was a tall figure, completely black, with a blurred face, like a shadow. Mark tried to start the car, but the lights did not respond. "This can't be happening," shouted Jeff, as the figure advanced toward them. The shadow approached and, in a guttural whisper, said, "The end is near." And with those words, the car was completely shut down. The three friends were never seen again. The legend of Clinton Road closed with one more horror story, and the road, as always, continued to haunt the unwary who dared to travel it. Chapter 1. The Shadow in the Night. Clinton Road is a place that, for many, is shrouded in mystery and horror. It stretches for several miles in Passaic County, New Jersey, and has earned its reputation as one of the most terrifying and desolate roads in the United States. But what really makes it sinister is not only its dark curves and the sepulchral silence that accompanies it on lonely nights. What makes Clinton Road a true place of terror are the stories, legends, and inexplicable experiences that have happened nearby. Many people have disappeared without a trace in its surroundings, and others have lived to tell stories that no one could believe. It was on a particularly dark night in late autumn when Dave, a curious 23-year-old, decided he wanted to see for himself what was on that road. He had heard the stories since he was a boy about the crying man, the strange black raven that appears at midnight, and the shadows that creep through the trees. However, nothing had struck him as real enough to keep him from being curious. After all, he thought, they were just stories, and like any good skeptic, he wasn't about to let superstitions terrify him. That night, he got in his car and drove to Clinton Road with a friend, Mark. They both shared the idea that all these legends were fabrications, tales to scare the faint of heart. Although a shiver ran down Dave's back as the first lights of the town disappeared behind them, he said nothing. The car's engine roared in the darkness, and the deserted road seemed to swallow any vestige of light. As they advanced along the path, a strange sensation began to take hold of Dave. The shadows grew unusually long, and the treetops seemed to form grotesque figures. It wasn't just the lack of light that made him uneasy, but something else, a persistent rustling, as if the wind was speaking. Dave looked at Mark, who seemed as calm as ever, but Dave couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was watching them. "We're almost at the spooky part," Mark said with a nervous smile. "Remember what they say about ghosts here?" Dave nodded indifferently. "It's just superstition, Mark." However, when they reached a particularly dark stretch of road, things began to change. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of them, walking slowly in the middle of the road. He was no ordinary person. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his face was obscured by a shadow. The figure walked with an erratic gait, as if floating. Dave slammed on the brakes. His heart leapt in his chest and his skin crawled. He couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, but all he saw was the thick blackness of the night. When he looked ahead again, the figure had disappeared. "Did you see him?" asked Mark in a shaky voice. Dave, speechless, nodded slowly. "That wasn't there before," Mark muttered. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Dave sped up the car, not looking back. As they drove further into the darkness of Clinton Road, they both realized they were not alone. Strange flashes began to briefly illuminate the horizon, as if a light was flickering through the trees. But every time they tried to focus, it disappeared. Finally, they came to a sharp bend where the landscape seemed to open up into a clearing. The air grew heavier, and the sounds of the outside world faded away completely. leaving them in a sepulchral void. Dave slowed down again, and the two stood there in complete silence. That's when they heard it, a soft whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Do you hear it?" asked Mark, his voice trembling with fear. "It's just the wind," Dave said. But he didn't believe his own words. The whispering became clearer until suddenly the figure reappeared. This time, it was closer, walking towards the car with slow, clumsy movements. When he was a few feet away, the figure's face emerged from the shadows. His eyes were empty, as if someone had ripped all the life out of his being. And when he smiled, his mouth was full of sharp, ragged teeth, like those of a hungry animal. Mark shouted, but before he could react, the car began to move on its own, sliding backwards, as if an invisible force was pushing it. Dave tried to brake, but couldn't. The car stopped in the middle of the road, and the figure, with its crooked smile, moved even closer. "What do you want?" cried Dave, his voice breaking. But the figure did not answer. It just kept walking towards them, step by step, approaching with an eerie slowness. The figure never touched them, but the feeling of being watched and stalked became more and more overwhelming. With one last glance toward the creature, Dave started the car and accelerated, not looking back. Clinton Road seemed endless, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the road. They were both shaking, out of breath, but relieved to have escaped. What they didn't know was that that night was not the end of their encounter with the unexplained at Clinton Road. In fact, they'd only just begun to discover the horrors that lay in the shadows of that cursed place. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The next day, both Dave and Mark tried to put what happened on Clinton Road behind them. The experience was too strange and frightening to fully comprehend. Neither dared to speak about what they had seen, as if the mere mention of it might bring back the presence that had haunted them in the darkness. The night on the road was still vivid in their minds, and although they tried to convince themselves that what they had experienced was nothing more than a hallucination brought on by fear, something would not leave them at ease. It was early morning when Mark called Dave, his voice barely audible over the phone. "Dave, you need to hear this," he said, agitated. "What's wrong?" replied Dave, still feeling that uneasy feeling that had been with him since that night. "I'm looking on the internet about Clinton Road, and I found something weird. Something to do with the missing persons." Dave listened carefully as Mark explained that, over the years, several people had disappeared near that stretch of road. Not only that, but it was said that people who disappeared were often seen soon afterward in the vicinity, as if they had never left. At first, the cases were dismissed as accidents or unexplained disappearances, but over time, rumors began to surface about what was really going on. Mark passed on to Dave one story in particular, that of a young woman named Sarah, who had disappeared on Clinton Road years earlier. Sarah had been driving down the road with her sister when, according to witnesses, her car simply stopped. Sarah's sister got out to get help, but when she returned, Sarah was gone. Her body was never found, but several people claimed to have seen her wandering along the road in the same area where she disappeared, always walking alone, staring blankly. Intrigued and disturbed, Dave decided to investigate further. Together with Mark, they began searching local records, police files, and even interviewing residents near Clinton Road. It was an older man who told them about a rumor he had heard when he was young. This road has long been cursed. They say that souls trapped on this land cannot leave, that they are doomed to wander among the trees forever. The stories varied. Some spoke of the presence of a masked man who stalked those who wandered too far into the darkness of the road, while others claimed to have heard screams coming from deep in the woods. However, there was a common pattern. Disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplained sensations were so recurrent that they could no longer be ignored. It was then that Dave began to wonder if that figure he had seen on the road was not just an illusion. It could have been Sarah, or perhaps someone else who had failed to escape the shadow that loomed over the place. The tales of missing persons continued to grow, and in Dave's mind, a clear picture began to form. Clinton Road was not just a dark and dangerous road. It was a place where trapped souls remained forever, condemned to live their last night over and over again. One afternoon, shortly after their investigation, Dave and Mark decided to return. This time, however, they were prepared. That they not only wanted to face their fears, but also to try to understand what was really going on there. They knew something was at stake, but they didn't yet understand what it meant. They reached the same stretch of road where the figure had appeared to them the night before. This time, the shadows seemed deeper, denser, as if the darkness itself was trying to absorb them. With the car windows down, the air felt heavy and cold, as if a storm was about to break, although the sky was clear. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Mark, visibly nervous. Dave nodded, but his stomach churned with every mile they drove. The road seemed endless, and the silence around them was broken only by the sound of the car's engine. At first, nothing happened. No one appeared on the road. There were no mysterious figures or strange lights. But as they approached the clearing, a strange sensation began to fill the air. Shadows seemed to move, slipping through the trees, as if something or someone was watching them. It was then that Mark, looking in the rearview mirror, saw something that paralyzed him. "Dave, look," he said in a whisper. Dave turned his head but saw nothing. "What? I don't see anything." But Mark was pale, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "Look beyond, in the woods. There's something over there." Dave, skeptical, looked back into the woods, where the shadows seemed to dance but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "I don't see anything, Mark. You're scared." But Mark was not. His gaze was fixed, and his body was trembling with fear. "It's not normal. There's something out there. It's watching us." Suddenly the car began to vibrate. At first it was slight, as if something was underneath them, but soon it intensified until the windows began to shake. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. The air seemed to become thicker, and the car's engine began to shut off intermittently, as if something was sucking it in. With his nerves on edge, Dave tried to start the car again, but something prevented him from moving it. The shadows around them intensified, and that's when they heard the whisper, low and deep, like a distant voice. He couldn't understand it, but the sense of dread was unmistakable. The figure appeared once again, not in the distance, but right in front of the car, so close that I could see his pale face, his empty eyes, and his mouth full of sharp teeth. He was smiling. "We can't stay here," Mark said in a shaky voice. Dave, without further thought, turned the ignition key with all his might, and in a moment of desperation, the car started again, accelerating at full speed. As they escaped, The figure watched them from the darkness, and with every meter they traveled, the sensation of being followed grew. When they finally made it off Clinton Road, the atmosphere was still charged with a nightmarish feeling. Something had followed them, something they couldn't see, but it had certainly touched them. That night, neither Dave nor Mark could sleep. They knew the road held darker secrets than they could have imagined. Chapter 3. The Last Visit. Weeks had passed since Dave and Mark faced the horrors of Clinton Road, yet the images of that night continued to haunt them, popping into their thoughts at unexpected times. The figure with the empty eyes, the shadows moving through the trees, and most of all, the sense that something was watching them, that they were never really alone. No one believed them when they told what happened, and although they tried to convince themselves that it was a bad experience that they simply had to leave behind, they knew deep down that what they had experienced was much more real than they wanted to admit. Mark especially seemed to be struggling with the experience. For days he was irritable and nervous, and his nightmares would not cease. He often awoke in the middle of the night, sweaty and shaking, claiming to hear voices whispering his name. Finally, it was he who suggested returning to Clinton Road, as if some inexplicable force was calling him. Dave, though filled with fear, felt he could not refuse. He knew there was something in that place, something dark and ancient that would not let them rest in peace. On the night of his last visit, the air seemed heavier than usual. The moon was barely visible behind thick clouds that were slowly creeping in, covering the sky with a blanket of shadows. As they drove toward the same stretch of Clinton Road, the two realized that the sense of dread was even more palpable than before. The trees, normally ominous, seemed to move around them, as if alive, watching them. The car lights briefly illuminated the dark silhouettes of the trees, but did not last long enough to reveal what was really there in the darkness. "Why are we here, Mark?" said Dave in a shaky voice. "What are we really looking for?" Mark did not respond immediately. He was concentrating on the road, his face grim. Finally, in a low voice, he said, "Something is calling me. It's like I have to be here, like there's something we need to understand." When they arrived at the clearing where it had all started, the atmosphere was different. The energy in the air was much denser. Dave could feel it, as if an unseen presence was lurking in the shadows. At first, nothing happened. They stood there, silent, staring straight ahead. But as time passed, the uneasy feeling increased. A cold breeze began to blow through the trees, and with it, the sound of something crawling in the distance. Suddenly the car's lights flickered and went out completely. In that instant, darkness engulfed everything. Dave tried to start the engine, but it didn't respond. The two looked around, unable to see beyond the car windows. An unbearable feeling of being watched enveloped them again. And the worst thing was that this time, it wasn't just a feeling. Something was there, with them. That's when they heard it. A whisper, soft but clear, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was close, just outside the range of their vision, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice, soft and mocking, whispering their names. "Dave, Mark," echoed the voice, creeping through the darkness. "Come." With his heart in his throat, Dave turned his head toward Mark, who was staring into the rearview mirror. His eyes were filled with terror. Before he could ask what was happening, however, Mark pointed to the back, where the shadows seemed to be moving. Something was slipping through the trees, something big, something that shouldn't be there. Dave, feeling an impulse of desperation, tried to start the car again, but the attempts were in vain. The engine was still dead. And that's when he saw it. The figure, that same figure they had talked about so many times, appeared right in front of them. He was walking towards the car with slow, shuffling steps. His eyes, empty and lifeless, reflected the starlight, and his mouth, inordinately wide, was formed in a grotesque smile. "Get out of there! Get out now!" shouted Mark, his voice ragged with panic. But Dave was transfixed, staring at that figure coming closer and closer. The figure, now only a few meters away from them, raised his hand. His skin, pale and wrinkled, was covered with cuts and scars. It was as if he'd been wandering the shadows for centuries. His macabre smile grew even longer, and then, in an unexpected twist, he began to speak, but not aloud, but in whispers that Dave could barely understand. You shouldn't have come." It was the same voice they had heard before, but now it was much closer, clearer. Dave could feel his breathing getting faster, the air getting thicker, almost unbearable. He knew they couldn't stay there much longer. Something terrible was about to happen, something they could not escape. "Run!" shouted Mark, and finally, Dave reacted. Without thinking, he turned the key once more, and this time the engine responded. The car started with a roar, and they both shot off down Clinton Road at full speed. The figure was left behind, fading into the shadows of the night. But what neither of them knew was that, as they fled, something far worse was being unleashed in the darkness. The road, in its eternal curse, would never let them go. Somewhere, deep in the depths of Clinton Road, their souls were trapped, doomed to return again and again, to face what lurked in the darkness.